January 21st, 1865, the morning sun cast long shadows across the wooden floors of the Union Army headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia, where 12 women sat in silence, their faces gaunt but resolute. The discovery in the barn outside Richmond had sent shockwaves through military command, and now Colonel Edward Warren Matthews demanded answers from nurses who'd vanished without trace nearly 3 years earlier. Sarah Montgomery spoke first, her voice steady despite obvious exhaustion. "We weren't prisoners, Colonel. We were volunteers." The statement hung in the air like cannon smoke. Major General Christopher Columbus Augur, commander of the Department of Washington, leaned forward in disbelief. These weren't captured Union nurses, they were women who'd chosen to disappear into Confederate territory during the bloodiest conflict America had ever known. The interrogation revealed an extraordinary tale. In March 1862, following the Peninsula Campaign, the 12 nurses had witnessed something that changed everything. At a field hospital near Yorktown, they'd treated both Union and Confederate wounded without distinction, as their training under Dorothea Lynn Dix had taught them. According to historical accounts documented in The Women's War in the South by historians at the National Archives, female nurses often operated in moral gray zones that military commanders found uncomfortable. Elizabeth Harper, the eldest of the group at 43, explained how they'd discovered a network of families hiding deserters from both armies. "Colonel, we found boys some couldn't have been older than 16 hiding in cellars and attics, terrified of returning to battle. Confederate boys running from General Robert Edward Lee's army. Union boys fleeing General George Brinton McClellan's command. They weren't cowards. They were broken." Martha Blackwell continued the narrative, describing how they'd made contact with Quaker families in Virginia who operated an underground network, different from the famous Underground Railroad but equally dangerous. These families harbored war-sick soldiers who'd witnessed horrors at Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville. The nurses had made a calculated decision, abandoned their official posts to provide medical care in secret. "But why the barn?" Colonel Matthews demanded. "Why isolate yourselves so completely?" Rebecca Thompson's answer was chilling. "Because the penalty for desertion was execution, sir. And the penalty for aiding deserters, whether Union or Confederate, was hanging. We couldn't risk being found. Not by your army, not by theirs." The interrogation lasted 14 hours. General Augur brought in Surgeon General Joseph K. Barnes, who questioned the women extensively about their medical activities. They described performing amputations, treating gangrene, managing typhoid and dysentery cases, all without proper supplies, often using improvised instruments and folk remedies taught by local midwives. Lieutenant Henry Morrison, the young officer who'd found them, provided his account. The barn had contained meticulous medical records, hundreds of cases, documented in neat handwriting. The women had saved an estimated 374 soldiers from both armies. Men who would have died from wounds, disease, or execution squads. As evening approached, Colonel Matthews faced an impossible dilemma. These women had technically committed treason by aiding Confederate deserters, yet they'd also saved Union lives. They'd operated outside military authority but within their medical oaths. Secretary of War Edwin McMaster Stanton himself would need to decide their fate. The 12 nurses were confined to quarters under guard, not quite prisoners, not quite free, while telegrams flew between Alexandria and Washington City, carrying a question nobody had expected to ask as the war drew toward its bloody conclusion. What price should heroes pay for unauthorized mercy? January 23, 1865, 2 days after the initial interrogation. Investigators from the War Department arrived at the Alexandria headquarters with orders to uncover the full extent of what they were calling the Deserters Hospital Network. What they discovered would challenge everything the Union command thought they knew about the war's hidden geography. Captain William Frederick Harrison led the investigation, assisted by agents from the newly formed Secret Service Bureau. They began mapping the network using documents seized from the barn, coded letters, supply manifests written in cipher, and a detailed ledger maintained by Sarah Montgomery that read like a humanitarian manifest rather than a military record. The network, they learned, stretched from the Virginia Tidewater through the Shenandoah Valley and into the mountains of western North Carolina. 23 locations in total, each operated by families with deep religious objections to the war, primarily Quakers, Mennonites, and German Baptist Brethren. The barn outside Richmond was merely the largest facility, according to records that would later be preserved in the National Archives as referenced in scholarly work on Civil War medical history. The network began almost accidentally. In spring 1862, a Quaker farmer named Josiah Pemberton found a wounded Confederate deserter hiding in his tobacco barn. Rather than report the boy to authorities, Pemberton sent for his neighbor, who happened to know Sarah Montgomery from her work at a Union field hospital. "I couldn't watch another child die," Sarah told Captain Harrison during her second interrogation. He was 17. Called himself Thomas. Had watched his entire company slaughtered at Seven Pines. Something in his mind had broken. We'd call it soldier's heart back then. Today you might call it something different. Elizabeth Harper provided the medical perspective. She described how they'd noticed a pattern. Soldiers suffering from severe psychological trauma were being sent back to the front lines only to desert again or die by their own hands. The Army didn't understand what we were seeing. Men who couldn't stop shaking, men who woke screaming, men who stared at nothing for hours. The surgeons called them cowards. We knew better. The operation had required extraordinary coordination. Martha Blackwell, who'd worked as a telegraph operator before the war, had established a communication system using sympathetic operators along various rail lines. Messages about grain shipments actually referred to incoming wounded. Livestock prices indicated whether routes were safe from military patrols. Captain Harrison's investigation revealed the nurses had treated approximately 618 soldiers over 33 months. 374 survived, while 244 died from wounds too severe for their limited resources. Each death was recorded with meticulous detail: name, if known, home state, approximate age, cause of death, and burial location. The financial aspect astounded investigators. The network had operated on donations from Quaker meetings, sympathetic merchants, and even some Union officers' wives who'd learned of the operation and quietly contributed. Total estimated expenditure: $43,000, a staggering sum that had purchased bandages, chloroform, morphine, surgical instruments, food, and clothing. But the most shocking revelation came from Rebecca Thompson's testimony. Colonel Matthews asked why we didn't just work through proper military channels, she said, her eyes meeting Captain Harrison's directly. The answer is simple: proper channels were executing boys for running from hell. We couldn't be part of that machinery anymore. Lieutenant Morrison, present for the investigation, provided a crucial detail. Among the documents in the barn were letters from 37 Union officers ranging from lieutenants to 2 full colonels who'd quietly directed wounded men toward the network rather than reporting them as deserters. Some letters contained phrases like "better this than a firing squad for a good soldier broken by bad circumstances." As Captain Harrison compiled his report for Secretary Stanton, he faced an uncomfortable truth. This network had operated successfully for years because parts of both armies had looked the other way. The question now wasn't just what to do with 12 nurses. It was whether to expose a conspiracy of mercy that reached into the highest ranks of military command. The implications were staggering as the war entered its final months. February 3, 1865, the investigation took an unexpected turn when Captain Harrison received intelligence that changed everything. Former patients of the Deserters Hospital Network had begun coming forward voluntarily, traveling to Alexandria to testify on behalf of the nurses. The first arrived on a bitter cold morning, his left sleeve pinned empty where an arm had once been. "Name's Jacob William Patterson, sir," he told the military tribunal that had been hastily convened. "Private, 20th Maine Infantry. Lost my arm at Gettysburg on the 2nd day, July 2nd, 1863. They sent me to a field hospital, did the amputation, then told me I'd be reassigned to garrison duty once I healed." He paused, his remaining hand trembling. "But the wound went septic. The surgeon said I'd likely die." Said it casual, like mentioning rain. Patterson described how a supply wagon driver secretly working with the network, had smuggled him out of the field hospital and transported him 70 miles to the barn outside Richmond. Miss Montgomery and Miss Harper, they saved my life. Cleaned the wound properly, used some kind of herbal poultice the local women taught them. Took 6 weeks, but the infection cleared. Over the following 10 days, 43 former patients appeared to testify. Their stories painted a portrait of medical dedication that transcended politics and military allegiance. Sergeant Thomas Benjamin Crawford, formerly of the 5th Virginia Infantry, Confederate, described how Martha Blackwell had performed surgery to remove shrapnel from his spine after a piece of artillery shell had paralyzed his legs. She wasn't a trained surgeon, Crawford testified, but the nearest Confederate hospital was 30 miles away and I wouldn't have survived the journey. She studied a medical textbook by candlelight for 2 nights, then operated with instruments she'd sterilized in boiling water. I can walk today because of her courage. The testimony that most affected the tribunal came from Daniel Christopher Morrison, no relation to Lieutenant Morrison, a former corporal in the 3rd New Hampshire Infantry. He described his psychological state after the Battle of the Wilderness in May 1864. I'd been in combat for 2 years. Seen things no man should see. After the Wilderness, something broke inside me. I couldn't load my rifle. Hands wouldn't stop shaking. Colonel ordered me to pull myself together or face a court-martial for cowardice. Morrison had deserted during a night march and eventually found his way to the network. Miss Thompson talked to me every day for 3 months, not about the war, about normal things. My family in Portsmouth, the shipyard where my father worked. She called what I had moral injury, said my soul needed healing as much as my mind. Nobody in the Army ever said anything like that. Medical expert testimony came from an unexpected source, Surgeon Major Jonathan Rutherford Hayes, who'd served at Union Field hospitals throughout the war. Asked by the tribunal to evaluate the nurses' medical records, he was unequivocal. These documents represent field medicine of the highest caliber, performed under impossible circumstances. Their survival rate, approximately 61% for severely wounded patients, exceeds that of many official military hospitals. The documentation alone is extraordinary. According to historical research preserved in the Library of Congress and referenced in studies of Civil War medicine, battlefield survival rates for soldiers with serious wounds rarely exceeded 50%, and that included facilities with full military support. Captain Harrison's investigation also uncovered testimony from families. The mother of Private Henry Augustus Thompson, 16th Connecticut Infantry, traveled from Hartford to testify. The Army sent me a letter in December 1863 saying my Henry died of wounds at Mine Run, but he didn't die. Miss Blackwell and Miss Harper saved him. He came home last month, alive because these women cared more about human life than military regulations. The tribunal, composed of Colonel Matthews, General Augur, and 3 other senior officers, heard testimony from Confederate veterans as well. The War Department had granted limited immunity to ensure honest accounts. Former Lieutenant James Edward Rutledge of the 32nd, Virginia described how the network had saved his younger brother, who'd been 15 when he enlisted, lying about his age, and 17 when he fled after Spotsylvania Courthouse. My brother saw his best friend's head taken off by a cannonball, Rutledge testified, his voice breaking. He was a child. These nurses understood that. They didn't see Union or Confederate. They saw traumatized boys who needed help. By February 12th, the weight of testimony had created an impossible situation for military authorities. The nurses had clearly violated military law, but the men and women testifying portrayed them as heroic figures who'd upheld medical ethics when official channels had failed. Secretary Stanton himself arrived in Alexandria to observe the final days of testimony, his face unreadable as he listened to story after story of unauthorized mercy in a time of authorized killing. February 15th, 1865, when Secretary of War Edwin McMaster Stanton entered the tribunal room, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Known for his harsh efficiency and unwavering devotion to Union victory, Stanton represented everything the 12 nurses had defied. Yet the case had become far more complicated than simple military discipline could resolve. President Abraham Lincoln himself had taken interest in the matter. According to documentation later revealed in correspondence housed at the Lincoln Presidential Library, the president had sent Stanton a brief note. These women chose conscience over convenience. Before judgment falls, ensure we understand what they understood that we did not. The political implications reached beyond military justice. Radical Republicans in Congress, led by Representative Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, saw the case as ammunition against lenient treatment of Confederate deserters. If we pardon nurses who aided traitors fleeing their duty, Stevens declared in a fiery speech on the House floor February 10th, we make mockery of every loyal soldier who stood his ground. Conversely, moderate Republicans and some Democrats viewed the nurses as embodying the humanitarian principles they claimed the war defended. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts argued that mercy given to wounded soldiers regardless of the uniform they wore represents the highest ideals of Christian civilization. The press had seized upon the story with voracious appetite. The New York Times ran a headline on February 8th, "The Angels of the Abandoned Barn, Heroines or Traitors?" The article detailed the nurses' backgrounds, their training, their service records before disappearing, their families. Sarah Montgomery's father was revealed to be a prominent abolitionist minister in Boston who fully supported his daughter's actions. She followed God's law over man's law, he told reporters. I could not be prouder. Southern newspapers, even in their diminished wartime capacity, found the story equally compelling. The Richmond Whig, operating under Union occupation, published testimonials from Confederate families whose sons had been saved by the network. This created an uncomfortable reality. The nurses were more popular in some Confederate circles than in Union ones. Captain Harrison's completed investigation, submitted February 13th, ran to 347 pages. The document revealed something that complicated matters further. 17 Union officers had known about the network and actively protected it. Several had even referred soldiers to it. 2 colonels mentioned in the report had since been promoted to general officer ranks. General Ulysses Simpson Grant, commanding all Union armies, was consulted by telegraph. His response was characteristically blunt. The war is nearly won. These women saved soldiers' lives. Unless they directly aided Confederate military operations, I recommend clemency. Coming from Grant, whose armies had crushed Confederate resistance through relentless offensive action, this opinion carried immense weight. But Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt took the opposite view. In a memorandum to Stanton dated February 14th, Holt argued that failure to prosecute these women would establish precedent that individual conscience supersedes military authority. The entire structure of military discipline depends upon subordination of personal judgment to lawful orders. The 12 nurses remained in Alexandria, technically under guard but treated more as protected witnesses than prisoners. They'd been moved from a bare military barracks to more comfortable quarters in a requisitioned hotel. Elizabeth Harper had even been allowed to treat sick guards and officers, her medical skills too valuable to waste. On February 10th, Stanton interviewed each nurse individually. His conversations, recorded by his personal secretary, revealed his internal conflict. To Sarah Montgomery, he said, "You understand that officers died because soldiers deserted soldiers you helped escape." Justice. Montgomery's response was unflinching. And I understand that boys survived because we refused to let broken men be executed for having souls that war destroyed. Stanton spent longest with Rebecca Thompson, the youngest of the group at 26. She described the moment she'd decided to join the network. I watched a surgeon at City Point Hospital refuse to treat a wounded Confederate prisoner. Said his supplies were for Union boys only. The prisoner died in agony. I realized then that I'd become a nurse to save lives, not to participate in selective mercy based on politics. The secretary probed the network's financing. Thompson revealed that several wealthy Northern women, including 2 senators' wives, had contributed funds through intermediaries. They couldn't support us publicly, but they believed what we were doing was right. One told me, "War makes beasts of men." Someone must remember to be human. As Stanton prepared his recommendation for President Lincoln, he faced political calculations that extended beyond the nurses themselves. The war was ending. Everyone could feel it. General William Tecumseh Sherman was cutting through the Carolinas. Grant had Petersburg under siege. Within months, perhaps weeks, the Confederacy would collapse. The question became, what kind of peace did America want? One that punished every deviation from military authority? Or one that acknowledged the moral complexities of a war that had torn the nation apart? Stanton's final report to Lincoln, submitted February 17th, remained sealed in the War Department files for decades. But its recommendation would determine whether 12 nurses who chose conscience over orders would face a firing squad or something else entirely. February 20th, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln sat in his office at the Executive Mansion, reading Secretary Stanton's report for the third time. Outside, Washington City bustled with the energy of impending victory. Inside, Lincoln wrestled with a decision that would define how history remembered mercy during America's bloodiest conflict. The president had invited unusual counsel for this decision. Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, known as Frederick Douglass, arrived at 4 in the afternoon. The former slave-turned-abolitionist leader had advised Lincoln throughout the war on matters of conscience and justice. Joining him was Clara Harlow Barton, who'd earned the nickname Angel of the Battlefield for her tireless work nursing Union wounded. "These 12 women did what I've done," Barton told Lincoln bluntly, "except they extended their mercy beyond the boundary of uniform. If that's criminal, Mr. President, then perhaps I've been a criminal too every time I've treated a wounded Confederate who fell into our hands." Douglass offered a different perspective. "Mr. President, the question isn't whether these women broke military law. Clearly they did. The question is whether military law should have required them to turn away from suffering simply because it wore the wrong color cloth." He paused, his powerful voice softening. "I spent years helping people break laws that said human beings could be property. Sometimes justice demands disobedience." Lincoln listened, then shared something that hadn't appeared in Stanton's report. His personal secretary, John Milton Hay, had conducted quiet interviews with families of executed deserters. "One mother in Ohio," Lincoln said, his voice heavy, "told Mr. Hay that her son was shot for desertion after he fled from Cold Harbor. The boy was 19, had watched his entire company die in 15 minutes. When they executed him, she received a letter saying he'd been a coward, but she knew her son. Knew he'd simply broken." The president stood and walked to the window. "I've signed execution orders for deserters. Believed it necessary to maintain discipline. But these nurses are asking me to consider whether we've been executing boys who were casualties of war just as surely as if they'd taken a bullet." On February 21st, Lincoln held a cabinet meeting. Attorney General James Speed argued for prosecution. "Mr. President, if individual judgment supersedes military authority, we have anarchy," Secretary of State William Henry Seward countered. "And if military authority permits no space for mercy, we have tyranny," Postmaster General William Dennison noted practical concerns. "The publicity around this case has made these women folk heroes. Prosecuting them might win legal principle but lose public support, particularly as we transition to peace." Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles added his perspective. "My son was wounded at Antietam. The surgeon who saved his life violated protocol to do it operated when regulations said the boy should wait for transport to a better hospital. I've never questioned whether that surgeon did right." These nurses faced similar choices. Lincoln requested one more piece of information. He wanted to meet the nurses themselves. On February 22nd, Washington's birthday, a coincidence not lost on anyone, the 12 women were brought to the Executive Mansion. The president spoke with each one privately. Sarah Montgomery described her father's abolitionist work and how it had taught her that law and justice sometimes diverge. Elizabeth Harper, at 43, the eldest and most experienced, told Lincoln about watching soldiers die needlessly. "Not from wounds, Mr. President, but from despair, from souls crushed by horror. The Army didn't have language for it, so they called it cowardice." Martha Blackwell's conversation with Lincoln focused on the nature of desertion itself. "Sir, we treated men from both armies. Some had deserted because they were cowards, I won't deny that, but most? They'd given everything they had. Their courage wasn't infinite, it ran out like ammunition or rations. Should we execute a soldier who runs out of courage any more than one who runs out of bullets?" Rebecca Thompson, youngest of the group, asked Lincoln a question that left him visibly shaken. Mr. President, when this war ends and we count our dead, will we count only those killed by enemy bullets? Or will we count the boys we executed, the men who took their own lives, the soldiers whose minds never recovered? Because if we count all of them, sir, the number becomes almost unbearable. Lincoln spent 30 minutes with the nurses collectively, asking about their medical work, their faith, their understanding of duty. As they prepared to leave, he made an observation. "You remind me," he said, "that mercy is not weakness. That sometimes the hardest thing and the bravest thing is to refuse to let circumstances make monsters of us." On February 24th, Lincoln issued his decision in a confidential memorandum to Secretary Stanton. The document wouldn't be made public until after the president's death, but its contents were clear. The 12 nurses would not face military prosecution. Instead, they would be discharged from military service without honor, but also without dishonor, administrative limbo that acknowledged wrongdoing without punishing mercy. More significantly, Lincoln ordered a comprehensive review of executions for desertion, particularly cases involving soldiers with documented psychological trauma. He also directed the Surgeon General to study what the nurses called soldiers' heart, with intent to better understand and treat it. The decision satisfied no one completely. Radical Republicans saw it as too lenient. Some military commanders viewed it as undermining discipline. But Lincoln, in his memorandum, explained his reasoning. As we emerge from this terrible war, we must decide what kind of nation we will be. One that punishes every technical violation of law? Or one that acknowledges that extraordinary circumstances sometimes demand extraordinary mercy? These women chose mercy. I cannot bring myself to punish them for it. On March 1st, 1865, the 12 nurses were released from military custody. Their fate and the network they'd built would remain largely unknown for another 50 years. March 3rd, 1865, the 12 nurses left Alexandria quietly, each departing for different destinations. The War Department had made clear that public silence about their case was expected, though not legally mandated. As the Civil War lurched toward its final bloody conclusion, their story faded from newspapers, replaced by accounts of Sherman's march and Grant's siege of Petersburg. Sarah Montgomery returned to Boston, where she lived with her father until his death in 1872. She never married, dedicating her life instead to establishing training programs for nurses that emphasized psychological care alongside physical treatment. According to records preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives, she wrote extensively in private journals about her experiences but never published them, honoring her agreement with the War Department. Elizabeth Harper settled in Philadelphia, where she worked at Pennsylvania Hospital until 1880. Her specialty became treating veterans suffering from what doctors were beginning to call nostalgia, or soldier's heart, the psychological wounds that wouldn't heal. She corresponded regularly with other members of the network, letters that survive today in the National Library of Medicine collections. Martha Blackwell moved to Ohio and married a former Union officer who'd lost his left arm at Shiloh. Together they operated a small farm and raised 4 children. Her husband, Captain Robert James Sullivan, had been one of the officers who'd quietly referred soldiers to the network, a connection they kept private for decades. Rebecca Thompson, the youngest, moved west to California in 1868. She worked as a traveling nurse in mining communities, areas where medical care was scarce and questions about one's past were rarely asked. She died in 1894 in San Francisco, her Civil War service unknown to her neighbors. The network itself dissolved slowly. The Quaker families who'd supported it returned to their farms and meetings, their role in protecting deserters unacknowledged. Josiah Pemberton, the farmer who'd started it all by hiding a wounded Confederate boy, lived until 1903, dying at age 87 without ever speaking publicly about his wartime activities. President Lincoln's order for a comprehensive study of psychological trauma in soldiers produced limited immediate results. Dr. Jacob Mendez. Da Costa published a paper in January 1867 describing what he called Da Costa's syndrome, a condition affecting Civil War veterans with symptoms including rapid heartbeat, anxiety, and inability to tolerate stress. His work drew partially on notes that Elizabeth Harper had shared confidentially with military physicians. The barn outside Richmond where the nurses were found was torn down in 1867. Local farmers salvaged the lumber. No marker indicated what had occurred there. The site is today covered by a shopping center, its history unknown to those who park there. The political dimensions of the case faded quickly. Lincoln's assassination on April 14, 1865, just 6 weeks after releasing the nurses, meant his memorandum on their case remained classified. Secretary Stanton, consumed by pursuing Lincoln's assassins and managing Reconstruction, never revisited the matter publicly. The soldiers saved by the network scattered across America. Some returned to their homes and families, carrying secrets about how they'd survived. Others moved west, seeking anonymity in territories where questions about war service went unasked. A few became prominent citizens. At least 3 former patients served in state legislatures, and 1 became a federal judge, but none publicly acknowledged the network that had saved them. The true story remained hidden for 53 years. In 1918, as America entered the First World War, a historian named Margaret Ann Fletcher began researching Civil War medical practices. In the National Archives, she discovered Captain Harrison's investigation report, unsealed after the 50-year classification period expired. Fletcher's book, The Deserters' Hospital, Mercy Beyond Battle Lines, published in 1921, finally told the complete story. By then, all 12 nurses had died. The last survivor, Martha Blackwell Sullivan, had passed away in 1913 at age 74. The book created scholarly debate. Some historians viewed the nurses as heroes ahead of their time. Others criticized them for undermining military discipline during the nation's greatest crisis. The debate itself reflected broader questions about the First World War, questions about shell shock, about the limits of courage, about what societies owed soldiers broken by combat. During the Second World War, military psychiatrists studying combat trauma rediscovered the work of Elizabeth Harper and the observations recorded in the network's medical logs. Her notes on moral injury and soul wounds influenced the development of combat stress treatment protocols that saved countless lives in that conflict and beyond. In 1978, the Department of Defense commissioned a study on the treatment of desertion throughout American military history. The case of the 12 nurses received detailed analysis. The study concluded that their medical observations about psychological trauma had been decades ahead of contemporary military medicine, and that their patient survival rates exceeded standards of the period by significant margins. Today, a small memorial stands in Alexandria National Cemetery. Dedicated in 2006, it honors Civil War nurses who served beyond the boundaries of armies. The names of the 12 women are engraved there, along with the phrase Sarah Montgomery wrote in her final journal entry before her death in 1889. We chose to remember that beneath every uniform beat a human heart, capable of breaking. The medical records they maintained detailed observations of 618 cases are now preserved in climate-controlled archives, studied by military historians and medical researchers. Their documentation of psychological trauma remains relevant to understanding post-traumatic stress disorder and moral injury in veterans. The barn may be gone, its location forgotten by all but historians with old maps. But the question the 12 nurses forced America to confront remains painfully current. When military necessity and human mercy collide, where does duty truly lie? There.